Welcome to yet another tutorial type video where I explain all of the thought process that went into making this particular animation. It's completely loopable and it's made in Blender using geometry nodes. So let's go through the thought processes, including all of the mistakes that I went through while I figured out how to create this particular looping animation. It's a Plexus style animation. So stay tuned, and the entire video has been sped up to 2.5x the normal speed, but the entire process is shown from start to end. To start off, I created a plane which I then subdivided to form a grid. On this object, I would later on create the geometry node. To convert the plane into a grid, I converted the plane into a curve, and then I converted the curve back into a mesh, with the profile being a curved circle. Once I was happy with that, I had to instant points onto every single vertex. I used a join geometry so that the original grid remains. I then used the subdivided icosphere to act as the points in the Plexus animation. If you want a step-by-step tutorial rather than a version that shows all of the processes and mistakes that I made, do let me know in the comment section and I'll definitely make more like that. So over here I realized that my computer slowed down, which means I was creating far more icospheres than was necessary. So I took a little time to figure out what exactly I was doing wrong. I figured out that I was actually placing the icosphere in the wrong place in the geometry node flow. I decided that I would have two types of spheres. I initially thought that I'd make one transparent, like a glass type material, and have the inside as some sort of emissive material. However, that didn't work, as we'll see later on, and I ended up keeping both the larger spheres and the smaller spheres, and then went on with a different form of materials for it. To create the actual Plexus motion, I created a clouds texture and I used that to displace the original cube. And to make it looping, to make the motion loop, I created a curve with an empty, and I chose to make the empty go around one entire round in the span of my animation, which was going to be at 30 frames per second for 300 frames. So it was going to be a 10-second long animation. To reduce the speed at which the actual movement occurs, I reduced the influence strength of the displace modifier. I also chose to decimate it a bit to add a bit more randomness to the Plexus shape, as I added in the camera and fixed the position to make something that I thought looked good enough. I used another empty to control the rotation of my camera so that I could get a perfectly looping round around my plexus as the plexus itself moved around. After fiddling around with the focal length and the positioning of my camera, I found something that I temporarily liked and thought was good enough. However, the size of every single one of the spheres seemed to be too uniform for my liking. So I wanted to add a bit of randomness and had to figure out by testing different nodes and looking at different nodes as to how I could actually create that randomness. Once I got something that I liked, I also decided that the smaller spheres would also have to have the same sort of randomness, except they would be kept smaller than the bigger spheres. Here I noticed that even though I liked this, areas were getting cut off, they were coming way too close to the camera. So even I tried pushing it back a bit, but I realized that it just wasn't going to work. I'd have to push it at least this far back. So that was leaving a lot of empty space both at the top and the bottom. So I had to figure out something to fix that as well. Once this much geometry has been added into the scene, my laptop at least tends to slow down quite a bit, and because of that slowing down, it's really hard to tell whether your animation is actually going at a peaceful speed, at a soothing speed, or if it's going way too fast. Because at the end of the day, when I actually exported at 30 frames per second, I was scared that it would actually become way too fast. But I decided that I'd make that decision later on and first figure out all of the other details to this particular render. And that started off with setting materials. I created a material for the actual Plexus grid as well as the two spheres, the inner and the outer sphere, and I had three separate materials set for them, and I assigned them before actually editing the materials. I thought that it would definitely be a black background with emissive materials. However, I later on changed that based on what I was seeing to look good. This is when I tried to create that glass shader. However, for some reason, the glass shader just did not work as I was expecting. I have no idea why, because I had screen space reflections and refractions checked. I also had the material set to alpha clip, and I tried alpha blend and alpha hashed. But even then, at no stage was I able to create an actual transparent material. I'm very unsure as to why that happened, because I used EV itself to create what I would consider acceptably transparent material in one of the previous videos, in fact the first video that I made on this particular channel, and it worked. So I'm not quite sure why this one specifically didn't work, and it didn't work till the end no matter what I did. But I guess I'll just have to figure that out later on. Probably do a little bit more research. I decided to end up just giving this an emissive material. Of course, I still tried to make it transparent, but that still wasn't working. But I thought that this still looked pretty well for what I was going for, what I had in my head. So I decided to just continue with this. However, that would also mean that I wouldn't be able to see the inner spheres, but I decided to keep the inner spheres present anyway, in case I happen to require them later on, which I in fact did need. Essentially, the issue that I was having with my Plexus grid being emissive is that the bloom seemed to be outwashing all of the other colors in the situation. Although I was trying to clamp the amount of bloom, because of the sheer number of strands that were emissive, I'm guessing that even the clamped values itself were still too bright for my liking, and without bloom, it doesn't look good either. That's why I realized that maybe an emissive type of texture is just not worth it. I realized that at this point, when I was removing the emission completely from the Plexus grid, the black seemed to look good. However, I required the background to be white, and in Eevee, if I was just to turn the background to white, everything would just become white. So I had to create a white background. However, because the camera itself is rotating, I realized that I'd have to create the white background all around and make that seamless as well. The background, however, wasn't exactly white, and to make it white, I'd have to increase the emission strength. But increasing the emission strength was pretty much destroying it because of the blue. So I thought maybe just a white background wasn't nice. So maybe I could try out a different color. That's when I realized that even though it's black, the background doesn't have to be too bright. Even with dark backgrounds, the black Plexus grid was still looking very much acceptable. So that's why I decided to just go ahead with that, because I thought this looked very well. However, the background still seemed a bit too plain, so I wanted some sort of variation happening in the background. So I added a noise texture to just make a few rough, darker patches in the dark background as well. At this point, I wanted to see if I could do something with the smaller spheres and probably have a few smaller spheres come out larger than the bigger spheres. So that's why I was just playing around with the max so that I could get a selection of just a few to be larger and then set that as a completely separate material. So that way I'd get a bit more variation to the types of spheres that are present in the Plexus grid. So then I was trying to figure out what sort of a material would work well for the smaller spheres that were being taken outside. And I realized that something could be done with just a lot of trial and error. I didn't want to add in another color because I was already using complementary colors of the red and the blue for the foreground Plexus and the background. So I wanted to keep it within that red, but I had to figure out how to do it. And I realized that by keeping this particular blue color as a transparent, what it does is it just subtracts from the red. So it gives like these darker spheres which aren't as bright, but they're still red. So I thought that looked really nice. So I decided to keep that as what would go on in the final render. At about this point, I noticed that even at 16 frames per second, it was going fairly fast. And so at 30 frames per second, it would be much faster than I had initially anticipated. So I decided to make the entire animation exactly twice the length, so that hopefully when it plays at 30 frames per second, it would be exactly the speed that I wanted. And yeah, that turned out to be a pretty good decision based on my preferences. So yeah, after that, the only thing that was left was rendering out the final animation to create this particular seamless motion graphic in the Plexus style. Be sure to check out this particular video that YouTube recommends, and also make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss out on future videos like this. Comment down if we should make tutorials, and we'll definitely create them as well. So keep creating, and hopefully you can create something beautiful from the techniques that you learned in this video.